January 2nd, 1945, Eastern Belgium. The Ardennes hills lie buried under 3 feet of snow, where the world has turned white, soundless and cruel. The Battle of the Bulge is collapsing into chaos. Frozen tanks abandoned, wounded men scattered between the trees, and the smell of exhaust and blood blending with pine. At the edge of a broken road near a nameless village, a shallow trench marks the ruin of a medical outpost. Its canvas roof has collapsed under ice, and the red paint of a weather-stained cross barely clings to a plank half buried in slush. Inside that trench, 12 military nurses cling to life. Their fingers, raw and trembling, move from casualty to casualty, changing dressings and thawing syringes over a jury-rigged stove that hisses more smoke than flame. Around them, moans of the wounded rise and fall with the wind like lost radio static. The last field doctor left 48 hours ago, ordered to evacuate when German patrols were spotted less than a mile away. Then an eerie stillness descends. The gunfire that had torn the forest minutes earlier stops mid-echo. From the ridge beyond the frozen creek, dark figures appear, helmets glinting. The nurses freeze, realizing the line has vanished. What happens next will be remembered not in official battle reports, but in the whispered accounts of soldiers who couldn't believe what they saw. The story of 12 nurses who held a trench, not with rifles, but with courage, begins here. By the winter of 1944-45, the Second World War had reached its most desperate tempo in Europe. Hitler's last gamble, the Ardennes offensive, had erupted on December 16th. Tearing a 50-mile hole through the Allied front. Nearly 500,000 German troops surged through the snow-choked forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, hoping to split the British and American armies and force a negotiated peace. For frontline medics and nurses, the battlefield became a maze of freezing mud and shifting lines. Temporary aid stations, intended to sit miles behind safety, were suddenly trapped in the middle of vicious counterattacks. Many of these posts were marked with red crosses clearly visible from the air, yet even that emblem, protected under the Geneva Convention, offered only a fragile guarantee. In the chaos of artillery and strafing runs, symbols often vanished beneath gun smoke and drifting snow. American field hospitals followed the troops forward. Mobile units of tents, litters, and portable surgical lamps powered by unreliable generators. Each was staffed with a handful of nurses, corpsmen, and surgeons trained to operate under near-combat conditions. Their orders were simple: stabilize, tag, evacuate. But by late December, the evacuation routes were gone. German spearheads had cut the roads, isolated towns, and surrounded pockets of wounded soldiers still waiting for trucks that would never come. Among those stranded units stood a small detachment near the village of Senlis, just east of Bastogne. They were part of the 16th Field Hospital, bolstered by British and Belgian volunteers. For days they had treated waves of frostbite casualties and shrapnel wounds streaming in from the front. Yet each dawn, the noise of battle crept closer. When communication lines died in the blizzard, the nurses received conflicting orders. Some to pull back, others to stay until reinforcements appeared. Out of duty, and perhaps stubborn faith, they decided to remain with the 24 lying in stretchers inside an unfinished trench beside the road. They would not know that the line behind them had already broken wide open. By the dawn of January the 2nd, the last functioning aid post south of Bastogne had ceased to exist, at least on any Allied map. The convoy meant to extract its staff never arrived. Snow had collapsed the radio masts, and batteries frozen solid muted every signal lamp. The war around the 12 nurses shrank to a white horizon and the groaning of their stretchers. The trench they occupied had begun as a forward triage pit, dug by engineers weeks earlier. Under bombardment, it became their only shelter. Sheets of corrugated metal bowed inward overhead. Ration tins and medical pouches were stacked as makeshift walls. Of the 23 wounded under their care, only a handful could still move. Morphine stocks were dwindling to crumbs. Blood plasma had frozen stiff inside its pouches. Yet routine never faltered. Dawn inspections, wound checks every 4 hours, notation of pulses on scraps of damp paper. On some level, they believed help was minutes away. Allied armor had retaken nearby villages, and rumors spread of Patton's Third Army pushing north toward them. The reality was far more complex. German Kampfgruppen were still operating in the woods, bypassing strongpoints, moving silently through snow to strike supply lines. In this shifting confusion, the trench of nurses became an unintended no-man's land between two encircling forces. Too allied to be safe from German patrols, too indistinct to draw a friendly recognition signal. It was here that the combatants' maps failed, but humanity's instinct took precedence. The men approaching through the storm that morning, infantry of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, saw neither a marked target nor an enemy formation. From a distance, they glimpsed the faint red symbols on bandages and the silhouettes bending over the fallen. Frozen wind carried no sound until one of the nurses, Lieutenant Alice Bernier of the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, fired a single green flare meant as a recognition signal. Its glow briefly painted the snow emerald, revealing the desperate tableau: a medical trench, an unarmed crew, and dozens of motionless bodies. That act of signal and exposure, both defiance and plea, would define the next 48 hours. The approaching soldiers paused, weapons lowered, and the nurses prepared for the worst, not yet aware that fate had briefly suspended the battle around them. Long after the smoke cleared, survivors struggled to describe how 12 nurses without rifles managed to arrest the momentum of war. The answer lies not in tactics, but in the strange gravity of compassion in a place built for destruction. Combat nurses in 1945 were among the most rigorously trained specialists in the Allied forces. Their routine blended surgical precision with battlefield improvisation, able to start intravenous lines in freezing darkness or amputate with bayonets sterilized over stoves. Yet beyond skill, they carried a moral charter. The wounded were not soldiers anymore, but patients, which erased nationality. It was an ideal tested every time a stretcher arrived, bearing a German tunic alongside an American one. Inside that trench, the medical hierarchy dissolved. Rank meant nothing when gauze froze to skin. The women turned their Red Cross insignia into a kind of banner, half defiance, half declaration that civilization still existed, even here, especially here. They whispered prayers, sang softly to calm delirious men, and rationed anesthesia with mathematical coldness that looked nothing like sentiment until one understood the cost of running out. Witness accounts later gathered from nearby units mentioned a stillness that felt sacred. The idea of nurses holding ground contradicted the logic of combat. Yet when both sides glimpsed an emblem universally recognized as mercy, something ancient preempted hostility, an unspoken agreement older than treaties. The nurses' courage, stripped of strategy, revealed a primitive signal in war's noise. The moment one human refuses to stop caring. It disoriented the veteran soldiers who watched from the tree line, safety catch fingers hesitating amid the snow. Their compassion had become a weapon stronger than any carbine, one that rewrote the rules of engagement, if only briefly. That flicker of humanity spread outward, reaching even those sent to destroy them. From the German side, the approach to the trench appeared first as another advance through the choking mist of the Ardennes, a slow crawl of squads probing through burned farmsteads and telephone wires drooping like black vines. Captain Erich Schmidt of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division recorded in his notebook that morning, "We followed blood trails into a hollow. I expected resistance. There was only quiet. Through binoculars he saw figures in dark coats, tending to shapes half covered with snow. It looked, at distance, like an organized position, until one of the figures raised a medical satchel instead of a weapon. That confused both sides. The rules were contradictory. Medics were to be respected, yet battlefields offered no certainty of ruse. Still, no rifle fire came from the Americans. His men waited for an order that never arrived. For nearly 10 minutes they watched, uncertain whether to advance or withdraw. Then, signaling discipline, Schmidt ordered weapons lowered. "No target," he wrote, "only nurses." The entry is brief, almost clinical, yet it marks a small crack in the front, where violence simply stopped. They moved their perimeter around the site and established a loose cordon instead of shelling it. On the tactical chart, later found in their command post, a tiny cross appeared at that grid. German artillery coordinates for the sector were quietly deleted. The gesture likely saved dozens more lives nearby, though no officer ever claimed credit. It was a nod to a convention, but also recognition of shared exhaustion. Both armies understood the winter had turned men into ghosts. For once, the Red Cross symbol worked exactly as it was meant to, as a firewall of decency, cutting through total collapse. To the Germans, the nurses' tenacity was bewildering, almost superstitious. To the Americans beyond the ridge, the continued silence was equally mysterious. They assumed the nurses captured or dead. Between these two misconceptions, a 48-hour pause took shape. A fragile peace carved out not by diplomats, but by respect for a single duty that transcended uniforms. And within that stillness, the story reached its breaking point. The first shells of the new year fell before dawn on January 3rd. They came from somewhere west, fired by American batteries that had no idea how close their rounds were landing to friendly medics. The concussion collapsed part of the trench roof. A cascade of snow and soil poured over the litters inside. Kerosene lamps went dark, and a low panic began. Choked, restrained, professional. Lieutenant Bernier shouted for calm and began dragging men toward the shallowest end, shouting through her scarf for anyone still walking to form a chain. Outside, tracer rounds cut red slashes across the fog, marking territory no one could see clearly. Radio lines remained dead. All the nurses had were colored flares and instinct. Then came movement to the north, a scattering of German infantry, retreating now under counterattack. From the nurses' position, the landscape was a theater of confusion. Enemy soldiers stumbling backward, Allied fire drilling into the trees, wounded men from both armies crawling toward the same low ditch. Amid that chaos, the women resumed their work with unearthly calm. They pulled the injured, German, American, civilian courier alike, into the trench, applying bandages by flashlight, using melted snow to clean instruments. At one point, an enemy sergeant, arm shattered by machine gun fire, dropped to his knees at the edge. Two orderlies raised rifles automatically. Bernier stepped between, pointing instead to the cross stitched on her sleeve. "Wounded," she said simply. The rifles lowered. She seated the man beside a dying American private and tied both their tourniquets with the same length of canvas strap. That image, a nurse standing between two enemies, lit by lantern glow as artillery bloomed in the distance, became the moral center of the battle. Men on either side, staring through periscopes or scope sights, hesitated to pull triggers. Something wordless spread through the ridgeline positions, a feeling that the usual rules no longer applied. For nearly an entire day, scattered duels dwindled into silence around that trench. In diaries later recovered, soldiers wrote of an unnatural pause, as if the forest itself refused to echo death any longer. Inside that pause stood 12 women refusing to run, nursing strangers by the light of gunfire. But on the second night, the thin thread of mercy was tested again. When a new German platoon, unaware of the silent truce, crept toward the hollow to finish what earlier orders had begun. Night fell swiftly, swallowing the valley in soot-colored shadow. Only the faint glimmer of the nurses' lanterns marked the trench's position, ghostly fireflies trembling in the wind. The new platoon, young conscripts from Saxony, barely 18, moved through the darkness with bayonets fixed. Unaware they were approaching a medical post, the rest of their regiment had sworn not to touch. The first shot never came. Instead, One of the soldiers slid on the ice, his rifle clattering into the open. The metallic ring shattered the quiet, jolting everyone awake. Bernier's head lifted instantly. She reached for the flare pistol, her only signal, and fired into the night. A brilliant streak of green hissed upward, bursting above the tree line like a ghostly aurora. The Germans froze. Its halo revealed every figure in silver light. The wounded sprawled in rows, the women kneeling among them, red crosses stark against ripped uniforms. The spectacle lasted seconds, yet it burned into every eye watching. Sergeant Max Keller, leading the first file of the platoon, later recalled, "We expected a trap. Then I saw them. Not soldiers, just people with bandages and tears. None raised a weapon." He lowered his rifle first. Around him, one by one, the others followed. Machine gun teams unclipped belts. Mortar crews dragged crates aside, and slowly, impossibly, silence reclaimed the countryside. Only the wind moved now, carrying faint cries of the wounded mingled with the rustle of branches. Captain Schmidt arrived minutes later to find both sides standing still, shapes barely visible under veils of snow. His field glasses caught the nurse's flare fading overhead. "Enough," he said quietly to no one in particular. He ordered his radio man to mark the coordinates with a red cross and transmit, "Lazaret, do not shell." Satiety. Around the trench, German soldiers began stacking their helmets at their feet. A gesture of surrender not to an enemy, but to compassion itself. Several stepped forward, offering canteens and blankets looted from wrecked supply depots. One helped carry a stretcher, guided by a nurse barely half his age. Local villagers hiding nearby later swore they saw both sides sharing the same watchfire that night, divided by language but unified in fatigue. No grand speeches, no handshake photographed for history, just quiet labor until dawn, when the green flare again split the morning mist, signaling approaching American reconnaissance troops. Those witnessing it from the ridges mistook it for a deceptive signal and held their fire. For 14 more hours the lull endured. By evening, the front line had moved elsewhere. The ridge and its trench were no longer in any battle plan. What remained was an improbable memory, a ceasefire born not from treaties, but from the courage of a dozen unarmed women who refused to abandon the wounded. When Allied units finally reached them on January 4th, they found the trench still intact. The nurses, frost-bitten and sleepless, stood among 60 survivors, Americans and Germans alike, waiting in the snow. And far off, as the rescuers approached, a handful of German soldiers lifted their hands in salute before fading back into the forest. The relief column that reached the hollow near Senlis on January 4, 1945, came expecting tragedy. Reports suggested that one of the forward aid postings had been annihilated. Instead, they found an orderly scene. Ashen-faced nurses working through exhaustion, the wounded laid out in careful rows, and a silence that did not belong to any battlefield. Major Harold C. Jennings of the 326th Medical Battalion filed the first official account that afternoon. In his report, he noted that the improvised trench had maintained continuous medical operations under enemy proximity for 48 consecutive hours. The finding stunned higher command. When he asked how they had survived without weaponry, Lieutenant Bernier simply replied, "We were too busy to be afraid." Casualties were heavy, but far fewer than expected. Out of the original 23 critical patients, 14 remained alive, most frostbitten, all conscious. Among them were 4 German wounded, who refused evacuation until the nurses were safely moved first. That detail appeared again in Allied interrogation documents reviewing the halt in German shelling along that sector. Analysts puzzled over it, unaware that moral instinct had overridden orders at the lowest tactical level. The nurses were transported first to Bastogne, then to a field hospital near Liège. There, army photographers took grainy snapshots, women leaning over stretchers, snow caked to their boots. The pictures appeared weeks later in home front newspapers, under restrained headlines. Medical team survives 2-day siege. No mention of the enemy's salute, no elaboration beyond military clarity. Yet, within units across the Ardennes, the story spread like a quiet rumor. The nurses who stopped a battle. Eyewitnesses trickled in over months. Truck drivers, artillery observers, even a captured German lieutenant who swore his men refused to fire on the cross. Each version carried small differences, but the same spine of truth. Compassion had crossed the gun line, and, for one brief window, rewired the instincts of war. For the nurses, recognition came slowly. Commendations were filed, misplaced amid the tide of paperwork following the offensive. Only decades later did surviving records confirm their names in after-action medical logs. They had asked for none of it. Their only question, recorded by Jennings when asked about medals, was whether the patients they left behind survived the evacuation. The answer, in most cases, was yes, because the fighting had paused long enough for them to be carried out alive. Across the line, fragments of the same story appeared in unexpected places. In April 1945, after Germany's surrender, Allied archivists collected captured field logs from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. One contained a sparse, typewritten note in its margin. Lazaret, respected, not taken, honor of troops maintained. There was no signature. That one sentence, sandwiched between artillery statistics and fuel rations, told the rest of the tale. Soldiers of both sides had recognized the medical neutral zone that never officially existed. When questioned later during debriefings, Captain Schmidt claimed he acted according to conscience, not command. His decision had violated standing orders, but no superior pursued punishment. By then, the front had disintegrated. The rules that mattered were the human ones. Schmidt himself became a prisoner in April 1945 and quietly corroborated American reports of the nurses' survival, describing them as figures of light in a forest of fog. In the Allied camp, written citations circulated briefly within the U.S. Army Nurse Corps. 12 Bronze Stars were authorized, though few recipients ever attended formal ceremonies. Several continued to serve in post-war hospitals in Germany and France, treating civilians from both sides of the conflict. Bernier, the senior lieutenant, would later comment in an interview from 1962, "We never surrendered. We just ran out of shouting." Public memory reduced the event to a footnote, a line in Field Hospital Chronicles listing an uninterrupted aid operation during combat. January 1945. Yet among medics, it evolved into something larger, a legend of vocational courage that blurred the boundary between enemy and patient. At reunions, aging veterans spoke softly of the moment the guns halted near Senlis, of the strange echo of silence over a valley usually trembling with artillery. Historically, the pause changed nothing strategic. The war thundered on. Months later, Germany lay in ruins. Still, within the statistics of the Ardennes campaign, 89,000 Allied casualties, 67,000 German, those 48 hours glimmered like a hairline crack of mercy splitting an iron wall. When historians retraced the event decades afterward, they found surviving fragments. The green flare shell preserved in a Bastogne museum, faded photographs showing nurses against snow, and testimonies from soldiers who remembered lowering their rifles in what felt less like defeat than relief. None of it altered the war's outcome, but together they confirmed a truth rarely written into official histories, that even inside the most mechanized slaughter, a handful of people managed to momentarily rewrite what it meant to win. And so the war moved past them, but the silence they created lingered, an echo between two armies that had momentarily remembered they were made of the same flesh. History tends to remember scale, the divisions, the artillery totals, the sprawling operations traced by arrows on maps. Yet occasionally, a fragment surfaces that defies the mathematics of war. The nurses of Senlis became one such fragment. 12 unarmed women whose endurance momentarily halted the relentless geometry of offense and counter-offense. They altered nothing strategically, but they changed, if only for 2 days, the emotional architecture of the battlefield. The scene they left behind lingers as something more than an anecdote. It embodies the paradox that defines modern war. Progress measured in tonnage and technology, interrupted by bursts of raw humanity that refuse to fit the equation. Under every sound of steel and radio code, a smaller contest continues. The struggle to remain human when the structure around you insists on dehumanization. The frozen trench in January 1945 was one of those rare coordinates where compassion proved operationally effective. It shielded the wounded better than barbed wire and, for 48 hours, forced combatants to imagine the supposed enemy as a person in pain. That recognition may have vanished the next day, but its existence was enough to remind both sides what their uniforms once claimed to defend: civilization itself. When the last survivor of the group passed away in the late 1990s, her obituary contained only 3 lines about the war. It did not mention guns, ranks, or medals, only the sentence, "She cared for men from both sides during the Battle of the Bulge." Perhaps that was the most truthful summary. In a world built on